Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar titled Ghost Guns, How They Are Made, Some of the Laws and Implications for Law Enforcement, brought to you by the University of Management and Technology. My name is John Hu. I will be your host today. And I'm the Director of Academic Programs at UMT. Before we begin the webinar, allow me to spend a few minutes introducing UMT to you. The University of Management and Technology provides affordable and high-quality education, 100% online. We offered more than 30 degrees and certificate programs, including business administration, criminal justice, homeland security, healthcare administration, computer science, information technology, engineering management, public administration, and so on. Our degrees range from associates, bachelor's, master's, to doctorate programs. UMT is truly global. We have students reside in 50 states, the District of Columbia, 4 US territories, and 78 countries worldwide. And we have been offering affordable and high-quality education for nearly 30 years. UMT is accredited by the Distance Education Accrediting Commission, DEAC, and UMT's degree program in project management are also accredited by the Global Accreditation Center of the Project Management Institute. UMT is an institutional member of the Council of Higher Education Accreditation and an authorized training partner of PMI. Over the years, UMT has established numerous partnerships, alliances, and scholarships with organizations. For example, we are a proud member of the Fraternal Order of Police University Consortium. So FOP members can receive benefits if they choose to attend UMT. And these benefits are also extended to eligible family members. We are also featured on the FOP Monthly Journal, and I have provided links here in case you're interested. So that is the quick introduction to UMT. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for the webinar. Our speaker for the webinar is Ross Small. Ross has been a UMT faculty in the Criminal Justice and Homeland Security Department for over 15 years. Prior to joining UMT, Ross worked as a federal law enforcement officer, as an undercover federal air marshal, and as a store detective. He also served in the US Air Force for 12 years as a member of the security forces, where he was awarded various medals, including Air Force Achievement Medal, National Defense Service Medal, and so on. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Ross Small.
All right, thank you, John, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen now.
Ross, let me allow you to share. 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, you should be able to share now.
Got it. So again, the name of this presentation is Ghost Guns, How They Are Made, Some of the Laws and Implications for Law Enforcement. What we'll be going over with this presentation, we'll discuss the proliferation of unserialized, privately made firearms, now mostly called ghost guns within the United States, especially with the advent of 3D printing technology and their growing use by criminals to circumvent our nation's gun laws. So I first wanted to start out with the problem. This is why we teach this subject at the University of Management and Technology. We've been teaching this for several years in our criminal investigation courses. But in recent years, law enforcement agencies from around the country at all levels, the local level, state level, federal level, have seen a huge uptick in the criminal recovery of what are unserialized firearms, since they have never been impressed with a serial number stamped onto them. They're also called by the federal government privately made firearms, but they're most commonly referred to these days as ghost guns because they're much harder to trace than traditionally manufactured firearms, which were the absolute norm for decades past. So I want to also start out with some research actually done by the Department of Justice. This was done over a 6-year period from the beginning of 2016 to the end of 2021. So they were able to show that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives received over 45,240 reports of suspected privately made firearms, i.e. ghost guns, that were recovered by law enforcement agencies all around the country, including 692 of homicides or attempted homicides. So this was over a 6-year period. But I do want to point out that this data is actually not complete because there's no federal law that mandates these local law enforcement agencies to report these actual ghost guns. So it's a lot of up to the discretion of these agencies. So it actually could be much higher than this right here. But as you can see, the trend is going up. It's steadily going up every year by year. So I would only suspect that it's probably going to go keep continuing to go up. But even still, with this data, it looks bad. It's compared to other firearms use, regular firearms is still kind of a drop in the bucket compared to regularly manufactured firearms. So this is a big issue, but it's not as big of an issue as I think it might get in the coming years as this becomes a really hot button political topic. As it gets worse, as more and more murders occur with these ghost guns. So I wanted to give some actual crime examples. I sort of just cherry picked 3 of the big name crime examples. So in 2017, 44-year-old Kevin Jansen Neal, he used a 3D printed AR-15 ghost gun. He committed the Rancho Tehama Reserve shootings, which left 6 people dead, including himself. In 2019, 60-year-old Nathaniel Burhow, he 3D printed 2 separate handguns. One was a .45 caliber handgun. He carried out the Saugus High School shooting, which left 3 people dead, including himself. And lastly, in 2020, U.S. Air Force Staff Sergeant Stephen Carrillo was a member of the far-right extremist group, the Boogaloo Boys. He used a 3D printed AR-15 ghost gun. He ambushed, killed federal law enforcement officer David Patrick Underwood. He used that same 3D printed AR-15 to kill Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office Sergeant Damon Gutzweiler. So I wanted to also start out with one of the really particular dangers of these 3D printed plastic guns, because they can be made these days with so much plastic that they can actually evade metal detectors because there's virtually no metal parts in them except for the bullets, the shell casing, the primer, and the firing pin obviously has to be made out of metal. But other than that, even the springs these days are actually being 3D printed out of plastic so that they don't even have metal in them. So this is a huge nightmare, potential nightmare for jails, federal buildings, courthouses, civil aviation, and the like. I wanted to show some actual examples of real life, real world 3D printed firearms that can evade metal detectors. So this particular gun right here has a 3D printed spring and a 3D printed barrel. So it doesn't even have a metal barrel. Even the barrel itself is plastic. So, but it's only a single shot. So the barrel actually deforms after the first shot, but still this is enough to get one deadly shot. So, which could obviously be enough, to take over an aircraft or kill a pilot. But this particular gun is called Liberator. It's created by Defense Distributed and it's already on the internet. It could be 3D printed by anyone with a regular cheap 3D printer at home. Virtually almost all plastic, and it could evade a metal detector. It's a 380 auto pistol, one single shot. This next one here is called the Songbird. This is another fairly new 3D printed firearm. This is a 357 Magnum, a single shot, and it doesn't even use a metal spring. It uses a rubber band spring so that there's no metal in the spring. Obviously, the firing pin would be metal, the shell casing would be metal, the primer would be metal, and the barrel would be metal. But that's not enough to trip off a metal detector. So even the barrel on this is plastic. So what do I talk about when I talk about regularly manufactured firearms? So regularly manufactured firearms were the norm for decades in the past. They're not ghost guns. These have serial numbers on them. But this only applies to federally licensed firearms manufacturers, which is any business that sells or distributes any firearms whatsoever that they manufacture themselves. So individuals that are hobbyists that keep the firearms for themselves, they make one firearm, 2, 3 a year for themselves, doesn't apply to them because they don't distribute them. But we all know a lot of criminals obviously sell these ghost guns, so that would immediately make it illegal for them to do that, because it's only currently legal to do this if you keep the firearm for yourself. But federal licensed firearm manufacturers are required to impress a serial number on just the lower receiver, the receiver of the firearm, which is the frame or the receiver under the definition. And I wanted to show what that part actually is on the firearm, because it doesn't include the barrel or the grips or the stock, any other part of the firearm legally does not have to be impressed with a serial number. So it's just this particular part. This is an AR-15 style rifle. You can see there in the very center, that's the lower receiver. And that would be the part that would be legally required, if it was made by a federal licensed firearms manufacturer, to be impressed with a serial number. So that particular piece right there in the very center of the AR-15 rifle example, that's where the serial number would be, but only if created by a federally licensed firearms manufacturer. This next example, this is a Glock style pistol lower receiver example. Again, this is only requirement for federally licensed firearms manufacturers. That would be where the serial number would go. It has to go on a metal plate because this is a Glock style pistol. It's, just Glock makes their lower receivers out of plastic anyway. It's actually it's a special type of plastic. It's not 3D printed. It's actually a compressed plastic, so it's extremely strong plastic. But anyway, you have to have a metal plate there embedded into the bottom of the plastic, and that's where the serial number goes. But all the other pieces you see there on the right, the barrel and the slide, don't legally have to have a serial number on them. Just that lower receiver has to. But again, this only applies to federally licensed firearms manufacturers. So I want to show these are some of the big names. I just found 6 random big name federally licensed firearms manufacturers you might have heard of: Springfield, Colt, Glock, Beretta, Sig Sauer, Smith & Wesson. So these are some of your examples of federally licensed firearms manufacturers. But by no means they're only multi-billion-dollar companies that have. There are a lot of smaller businesses that also have federally licensed firearms manufacturers licenses, but it is pretty daunting to get this firearms manufacturer's license from the federal government. It's not a very easy task. I also wanted to go over some historical examples, because this is not like a brand new phenomenon. This has been going on for years. I mean, obviously the first ghost guns were, homemade, flintlock rifles made at home. Everybody made their own guns back in the day with no serial numbers. That was the norm. So that would be your original ghost guns, would be your flintlock musket rifles, shot musket balls. But in the last 100 years or so, obviously, most guns are made by actual federally licensed firearms manufacturers and have serial numbers on them. But this is one particular firearm, a guy named Philip A. Ludi. He was in the United Kingdom, and they have much more stringent gun control laws, again, for their citizens. So he wanted to protest that. So he actually figured out a way to create his own homemade 9mm submachine gun. He called it the Luti. And he actually wrote an entire book on how to do it yourself. And it's out there now. So this information is out there, and there's been thousands and thousands of these guns have been made, not just by hobbyists, but also by criminal syndicates as well around the world. So this was a big thing in Europe. A lot of crime groups would make these guns. Another example, would be the Carlo. I found this. This is in the Palestinian Authority. This is another homemade ghost gun, no serial number, made by the Palestinian militants. It's been used to kill Israeli citizens and Israeli police and Israeli soldiers. So this is another example of another deadly ghost gun throughout history, no serial number, that are just homemade guns. It's called the Carlo. It's based off the Swedish Carl Gustaf M45, and it's Egyptian Port Said variant. So I wanted to first start talking about, in last year, this is the big thing. Before last year, citizens were able to buy 80% finished lower receivers, which means the gun wasn't 100% finished, it was only 80% finished. So the customer would finish the last 20% of the gun. So the theory was, because the gun's not 100% finished, it's only 80% finished, it's not a firearm yet. That was the legal theory behind this. So the companies that would make these didn't have federally licensed firearms manufacturers licenses, and they didn't do background checks on these people, and there was no serial number on these guns. So you would be able to buy these kits with these jigs and these tools, these little drill bits and mill bits, to basically drill out the last parts of this gun to make it a functioning firearm very quickly, I might add. And then all the other pieces come along with the kits as well. Everything has no serial number, no background check whatsoever. So I'm going to get to the laws later at the end of the presentation, but the Joe Biden administration has tried to essentially close this loophole in 2022 through a rule change. But here's these 80% lower builds in detail. So, like I'm saying, before the ATF Final Rule 2021 R-05F, definition of frame or receiver and identification of firearms, before it took effect last year, it was perfectly legal for individuals to purchase these 80% lower receiver kits. No serial number whatsoever, no background check. And they were able to finish the firearm sometimes within 15 minutes, at least the drilling part. And then you would put all the pieces of the gun together as well. It would come with all the different pieces. But then you'd have basically a perfect firearm that functioned just as well as a regularly manufactured firearm. So this is an example of the AR-15 style ghost gun kit. As you see, there's the lower receiver there on the left, and that red box is the jig. So you put that lower receiver inside the jig, and then you use those tools that comes with the kit to drill out the last little bits of the gun of that firearm to make it functional. And then you add all the appropriate trigger springs and then obviously the barrel, the slide, the top, the bolt, the charging handle, the stock, buffer spring, all the other little pieces that go with the gun to make it actually a functioning firearm. The next one, this is a Glock style pistol kit. Same thing, lower receiver, no serial number, comes with a jig. You put the gun inside of the jig, comes with the tools, you drill out the last little bits, and then you'd also have the top slide, the barrel, springs, and all the other hammer and all the other parts that would go. I do want to note, so I was doing some research online. There's been a federal district judge in Texas, a conservative one, that did rule in favor of a lawsuit from this one particular 80% lower build company that makes these kits, that is claiming this violates their Second Amendment rights. So currently and a bunch of other companies in Texas jumped on the lawsuit. So there's an injunction right now preventing the federal government from enforcing this rule against certain Texas businesses. So I just wanted to throw that out there until that gets to the appeals court and they decide what they're going to do. There's a small handful of companies in Texas that are still technically selling these kits with no serial numbers and no background checks. So now I wanted to get to the point of the 3D printed guns. So I believe that due to this recent law interpretation change by the ATF Final Rule 2021 R-05F, many individuals are now simply switching to 3D printing their own ghost guns at home, because these 80% lower kits that are being sold online require a background check, and the lower receiver must now have a serial number, so they're no longer. Okay, so a little more in detail, the lower receiver itself, like I was saying, which normally has a serial number on them, they can be 3D printed at home on these cheap 3D printers, like the one I have behind me. I'm going to get to after the presentation. I'm going to go quickly over, but this is just the Creality Ender 3 3D printer that I have here for less than $200, like $165 for this thing. And you could basically make your own lower receiver, and then you can purchase the other parts of the gun, like the barrel and the hand grips, the charging handle, the stock, all those other parts do not require background checks because they do not have serial numbers. So you'd be able to just 3D print the lower receiver, which is the crucial part, the frame of the gun, the lower receiver. You could 3D print it at home with no serial number, have a ghost gun, and then you buy all the other pieces and then put it together like you see down there on the right. That's a ghost gun with a 3D printed plastic lower receiver right there. I do want to mention that Congress could ban this practice under federal law if there were enough members to vote for such a new federal ban, but we all know that Congress right now is sort of, there's a juggernaut within Congress. Everything's kind of binded up, so I don't think they're going to be able to come to any agreement, especially on such an issue anytime soon. I wouldn't expect it. But in theory, the Congress could come together and ban this practice if they pass the law. So it all starts with these 3D CAD files. So people create these guns in a computer, basically. So instead of creating them physically out of metal, they actually take an existing gun and then they very meticulously go in a computer and they remake the gun inside of a computer to all the perfect dimensions. So you have a completely three-dimensional model of the gun and all the individual parts of the gun completely in a computer. So our nation has been pushing for this STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics careers. So I'm thinking this is only going to get more and more popular as the years go by, because there's so many Americans that want to try to get into manufacturing types of jobs. So this is only going to get more and more popular. I was mentioning previously that company Defense Distributed that made the Liberator pistol that is able to evade metal detectors. They've been embroiled in many lawsuits ever since they've been trying to upload 3D CAD files of guns onto the internet. And the US State Department was claiming that it violated export laws for giving out information about defense stuff to potentially non-citizens or people outside of the nation. But the Defense Distributed did file a lawsuit and it was settled. But there hasn't been any federal legislation passed in regards to this. So that same company, Defense Distributed, they now sell what's called the Ghost Gunner 3, the GG3. It's $2,500. So it's a miniature little CNC machine. So CNC stands for Computer Numerical Code Machine, and it's the same concept. It's not the same concept as 3D printing. This is more. It's not additive. It removes material. So you start with a big chunk of metal, and it has little drills in there and liquid, and it slowly cuts away all the pieces until you see right there in the center, you get yourself eventually a nice aluminum lower receiver ghost gun with no serial number. So you can have a little mass producing firearms factory in your house, essentially. and like you see there on the bottom right, that's a fully assembled, AR-15 ghost gun. You just would purchase the other parts separately and add them all to that lower receiver that doesn't have a serial number. So I wanted to mention that this is some new, fairly new technology that's out there called the Ghost Cutter 3 that's available. So when 3D printing is different than removing material. So it starts out, like I said, with the 3D computer aided design files. There's a three-dimensional object in a computer, and it slowly builds it by a layering method. It's called additive manufacturing. So it slowly adds to the part over by time by time. So it extrudes molten plastic through a tiny nozzle and moves back and forth and up and down through this precise X, Y, and Z axes. And the part is slowly built up over time. Like you can see on the left side, that's a lower receiver of the 3D printed firearm I have here with me as an example. And you can see it slowly builds the firearm up over time on the right. So 3D printed gun makers are in the process of experimenting with different types of filaments to try to make their guns better and better. So these different filaments, some are stronger, some are weaker, some are more flexible. So they're working with these different types of filaments, trying to come up with the best firearms. So I would suspect that year after year, these 3D printed guns are probably going to get better and better. So I want to show an example of a bunch of different types of filament rolls. So this is how 3D printers work. You buy these rolls of these PLA, polylactic acid, which is a thermoplastic monomer. It's a sort of organic plastic. So you buy them and you load your 3D printer with them. They're rolls of these long strings of 3D printing plastic. And so some of them have different characteristics than the others. I have mine loaded with carbon fiber as an example, black carbon fiber, but you can use different types of plastics. So like I said, they're experimenting with different types of plastics to make the guns better. So I would suspect the guns are going to get better and better as the years go on. So here's some examples of some kind of broken, cracked 3D printed guns I found online. They have, like I said, they have a tendency to crack or break, explode, some even melt. Because we're sort of in the early stages of this 3D printing gun. I mean, I would say so, not in the infancy, but we're still sort of in the beginning stages, maybe the middle stages of these 3D printed guns. So, but I suspect they're going to get stronger and stronger as the years go by. So I wanted to mention that now, like the previous gun I was talking about, the Luti, which was a ghost gun made in the United Kingdom. That gun is made by homemade parts from plumbing stores and hardware stores. That has a hydraulic tube that's not rifled, which is called a smoothbore firearm. But now, these days, these 3D printed gun makers are figuring out how to actually rifle the inside of the barrels so that there's actually a twisting corkscrew pattern of lands and grooves on the inside of the barrel. So it actually gives the bullet a spin as the bullet comes out, which actually gyroscopically stabilizes the bullet, makes it more accurate. So they're just getting better and better and better. So the end result of these homemade guns, a lot of them are almost as good as a regularly manufactured gun. So this is one type of way to do it. They'll buy a rifling button, and you drill out the inside of the gun barrel to the appropriate inner diameter, and you use this rifling button right here, and you forcibly push it through the barrel, and it cuts the corkscrew pattern on the inside. And like I'm showing here, there's a hole down the middle of the barrel. When they use hydraulic tube, as their barrels. You could purchase them. They have thick barrels, and there's obviously no serial number or background check required for purchasing hydraulic tubes. But you would just use a simple vise to press a punch down the barrel, and it would push the rifling button through. And it would, as you see there on the right, it creates those lands and groove carved cut into the inside of the barrel. But there's a new way now. So this is a new way that they're doing. If individuals don't have any hard tools at all, and a lot of people who do 3D printing don't, they're gamers and things. They don't have tools. They don't have vices and all types of stuff like that. They don't have drills and all this. So a lot of them want to figure out how to rifle a barrel electrically. So this is called the electrochemical machining method. It's been around for a while, but not for rifling barrels per se. This is sort of an adapted technology that they've taken advantage of, and they're using it to cut the rifling on the inside of the barrel. So like you see there on the right, they're creating the chamber and the rifling inside of the barrel. So it's basically, it's virtually almost the same as a regularly manufactured gun barrel in the end. Which all you need is a 3D printed plastic tool to put down the inside of the barrel, and then some copper wire, a DC direct current source, like a computer DC source, and some salt water, and a little water pump that you can get like an aquarium store. So this is what I was saying. This is on the bottom right, bottom left, and then the bottom right, there's those 3D printed plastic pieces that have those that corkscrew pattern carved in the outside of them, and you put that copper wire, you wind them down the sides of that little tool, and that's where you would send an electrical current through, direct current, the positive and the negative electricity. And then you take that tool and you push it down, slip it down in the inside of a regular metal tube, like the hydraulic tube. And like I'll show here, you flow salt water down, and as that electricity is flowing, it's basically slowly cutting away the the inside of the barrel. So as you see down here on the bottom left, there's a picture of the tool with the wires being inserted in the barrel that has no rifling. You flow some salt water through while the electrical current is going, and it slowly but surely cuts and cuts and cuts and cuts into the barrel using the electrochemical machining method. And as you see on the right side there, that is the end result. That is a nicely rifled internal barrel that has a nice corkscrew pattern with the lands and grooves, so that would be able to fire a very accurate bullet that could come out of that gun. So the gun I'm going to show you behind me that I have been experimenting printing at home is the FGC-9 Mark II. It's mostly 3D printed, not all 3D printed, but it's basically a mixture of 3D printed parts and also easily manufactured metal pressure bearing parts. And then also there's springs, screws, nuts, bolts, and other things you purchase. The total cost is about $400. You first download the 3D files, from the internet, or you can take a flash drive. Someone can hand you a physical flash drive or a CD, and you can upload it to your computer that way. If you don't want to, if some people don't want to go on the internet to download them, they could transfer them around on flash drives and CDs and discs and things like that. But then they use a slicing software to basically slice the file format into the appropriate file format for your particular 3D printer. So each individual part is then 3D printed slowly, like I was showing previously on the 3D printer. Again, this is another example of the Ender 3 3D printer, the very cheap $165 3D printer that most people use in society out there. That you slowly 3D print each part, and then you'd also source all the other parts, like shown here. Some of the parts are, you don't need a welder, but they recommend a welder, but there's a way to do it without a welder. But you know, the bolt and the barrel obviously are metal, and as are the firing pin and other parts, the springs and screws and stuff. But you know, you could find all those parts at hardware stores and plumbing stores and things like that, or on the internet, and, you know, springs and things. So you would put them all together, and you'd end up getting the final result as the firearm. So it's like you see on the left there, there's the gun in the computer, and then the next two pictures on the right are actually really fully built physical FGC9 Mark II firearms. So this is probably the most popular right now of fully 3D printed guns. It's not just the lower receiver, like this is the whole gun, pretty much almost the entire gun is 3D printed, you know, to include like the pistol grip, the handle, the magazine, not just the lower receiver, but also the upper receiver and the buffer tube and the stock. So almost everything is 3D printed in plastic at home. And then just the last little bits, like the springs for the hammer and the metal barrel from which you'd get as a hydraulic tube. The last little bits you would purchase separately. But most everything is just 3D printed at home. But it's pretty much comparable to like your 9mm Uzi, 9mm Tech 9, or 9mm Mac 10. This shoots a 9mm handgun bullet. I also want to talk about metal 3D printers, because this is not brand new, but this is fairly new. And I would suspect in the next coming decades, the price will probably come down. Right now, this is a little bit too expensive for your average consumer to have. You know, these go for millions of dollars, these metal 3D printers. Instead of melting plastic, it takes like metal powder and uses a laser to sinter and melt the metal powder right at the spot, just like a 3D printer with plastic would do. Slowly builds the part out of metal though. So as you can see, that's a 3D printed metal gun on the right side there. So there it is again, that this gun is an actual gun made by Solid Concepts, incorporated out of Austin, Texas. It's a fully 3D printed metal firearm, and it's, you know, an accurate, good, reliable metal 45 caliber pistol. So not only can you do 3D printing guns, you can actually now you can do plastic casting molded guns. So basically, you would make your own ghost gun lower receiver. Instead of out of a 3D printer, you would use liquid polymer plastic in these casting molds. You would mix this epoxy together, 2-part epoxy, pour it in those molds you see there on the left, you bolt it together, and you wait for it to dry, and then you get out, the final result is the lower receiver ghost gun with no serial number. So you don't need a 3D printer to do this. Additionally, I want to talk about some another technology that's out there. It's 3D scanning. So if someone doesn't know how to make the firearm in the computer, doesn't have 3D CAD skills, you know, or if they don't want to download the files from the internet, they think they might get monitored or seen, they could, in theory, scan an existing firearm. You know, or scan each and individual part of the firearm. You could scan it physically. You go around with a 3D scanner. It's like a bunch of lasers, and it sees the object, and it puts that object physically 3-dimensionally in a computer, just like a regular 3D printed gun file. But you know, you would do it individual parts. They would do individual, like the lower receiver, they would just focus on the lower receiver, or just focus on the trigger group, or whatever. So I want to mention that not only could they 3D print the lower receiver itself, they can actually 3D print a reverse pattern mold of the lower receiver. So you can do either or. You could do the inverse, the opposite of the lower receiver. You can 3D print the exterior of a 3D of the lower receiver, like I'm showing here. You could basically 3D print the mold itself. This is an AR-15 example. And then you would fill that with liquid polymer plastic. And some of that liquid plastic polymer is stronger than 3D printed plastic itself. So for a lot of people, this is the preferred method to make ghost guns. They believe it actually is stronger than 3D printed lower receivers. And again, you can even buy these kits as well. If you don't want to make the kit, you just go out and buy it with all the bolts and all the other thing. And they even sell the liquid polymer plastic polymer. You would just mix it together like an epoxy, put in a bucket, stir it in the two different halves, mix it together good, pour it into the mold, wait for it to dry. It gets extremely hard. You take the mold apart, and then there you go. You've got your fully physical plastic hard lower receiver ghost gun with no serial number and no background check. I also want to talk about sand cast metal guns, because if you could do that with plastic or polymer, you can obviously do it with metal as well. But they do it with sand cast metal because it has to contain the hot metal. This is more of a niche thing. But it is out there. You can see videos of people doing this on the internet. You need access to a propane tank and a blower fan, some insulation, and obviously protective equipment. But it's not impossible. I mean, you could definitely, if you have a garage and a lot of some open outdoor space, you could do this at home. You could basically melt your own aluminum and pour them into these sand casts molds and create your own ghost gun lower receiver fully out of metal instead of out of plastic. So you basically virtually have almost a regular aluminum lower receiver AR-15 with no serial number as the end result. I also want to mention the combination of 3D printing and that liquid metal production, because now it's possible to actually 3D print an intricate part that might not readily be able to be molded, and you can put it into a plaster mold, and you let the plaster dry around the 3D printed plastic part. You put it into a oven, and it melts out the plastic, and it leaves behind the perfect reverse image, the mold of where the plastic used to be. So then you would pour your hot liquid molten aluminum into that cavity, and you get as the end result a virtual perfect copy of the part that was 3D printed out of plastic. So that is possible now. So this is a website owned by Defense Distributed, that company I was mentioning previously. So DevCAD, they allow users to download 3D CAD files online. I guess as sort of a happy medium between them and the State Department, they do now they do a little bit of vetting for individuals that can sign up for this. So it has to be an American citizen that signs up for this website, and they do a little bit of vetting to make sure of that, and they have to pay money. But any American citizen can go on here and pay for access to download all of these various 3D printed gun files. And I would assume even upload individual people can actually make their own gun files and upload them on here as well. But there's just countless numbers of 3D printed capable lower receivers and other types of firearms on this website. And there's other websites out there as well. And I'm sure there's places all over the dark web, and there's, you know, individuals sharing files as well all over the internet with these types of firearms. So like I was saying, in 2013, the US State Department, they stated that distributing 3D gun files violated arms export laws. But it was, like I said, it was successfully challenged in court. There's not been any federal legislation specifically banning this practice. But I do want to point out that a lot of these 3D file repositories, like, you know, MakerBot and other regular websites, they do have voluntarily ban the posting and sharing of 3D gun files, and they'll actually also work with law enforcement, honoring subpoenas and such. If you're wondering who might have downloaded or uploaded 3D gun files, that's something to know. I also want to mention this particular bullet. This is called the Dagny Dagger. It's a fairly new armor piercing bullet, and it's partially 3D printed. The plastic part of the shell casing is plastic, and the there's a little sabot that surrounds the bullet itself. The bullet is like a little dart, like a sharp dart dagger in the center, and then it's hidden inside of the little plastic sabot. So because of that, when the bullet comes down the barrel, you know, there's no ballistics striations that are carved into the bullet itself. So there's no really any ballistics left behind. So that's something to realize. I mean, obviously there'd be ballistics on the plastic sabot, but not on the bullet itself. But apparently this bullet is capable of piercing law enforcement body armor at the level 3A at the very least. And this could possibly be perfectly legal right now under our current laws, because apparently under the federal law it says a handgun bullet cannot be made from one or a combination of tungsten alloy, steel, iron, brass, bronze, beryllium, copper, or depleted uranium. So apparently this bullet is probably made out of something other than that to kind of get around the ban. But I suspect that maybe, you know, even though currently this bullet might be legal, Congress might actually take a look into this and actually close this loophole right here. But who knows? They might make another one with another type of metal next time. But yeah, so there's a lot of people out there that are trying to circumvent the laws and stuff, and read into the letter of the law and get around it. And so these are 3D printed auto sears, also known on the streets as switches. So there on the left side, that's an example of an AR-15 style 3D printed auto sear. These used to be sold all on the internet, but now, you know, the ATF has been cracking down on this practice, because this is illegal to be even in possession of if you don't have a you know, federal firearms license to have machine guns. But now individuals have figured out they can just simply 3D print them at home instead of going online to purchase them. You can just download the files and 3D print them yourself. And you could turn a fully legal semi-automatic AR-15 or perfectly legal Glock pistol. You could convert either one into machine guns with just adding this little teeny tiny piece to them. And, you know, takes just minutes to add these pieces to the gun. It's very quick, but it is a felony for people to be in possession of these parts right here. It's also illegal under most state laws as well, because most state laws have kind of copied the federal government's law, the wording from their law. And, you know, the importance of having serial numbers is because of the potential for restoring obliterated serial numbers, because for, you know, generations past, the regularly manufactured firearms were your common firearm that law enforcement would see at crime scenes. So even if the serial number was scratched off, there's ways of trying to restore the serial number to see. But like I said, in ghost guns, they've never even been impressed with a serial number to begin with. So they've just never had a serial number. But these regularly manufactured firearms, a lot of them are impressed with these machine dies that sink the numbers deep into the metal. So like I'll show right here on this next slide, forensic scientists and law enforcement, they can actually smooth down that area where the serial number was scratched off, like you see on the bottom left there. A criminal used a grinder to scratch it off. They can actually smooth it down, add this etching agent, and it sometimes can allow the serial number to rise, kind of mysteriously rise to the surface, and then photograph it and see and have it as evidence, and then they can know what the actual serial number used to be. So this sort of shows the importance for having impressed serial numbers on firearms. Now I want to get into the federal laws. So like I was mentioning with that armor piercing bullets, it's actually been illegal to manufacture, import, or distribute these armor piercing cop killer handgun bullets, not rifle bullets, but just handgun bullets, bullets that are designed for handguns. But there's still lots of those old boxes that were made before 1986 that are probably still out there in society, because I'm sure there were millions of these bullets made before 1986, before the ban went into place. But again, I think that bullet that I was mentioning earlier, the Dagny Dagger, I think it gets around this ban because they don't use that, the different types of metals that are banned. I mean, who knows what type of metal is used in that particular bullet that makes it capable of piercing body armor. And I was also mentioning one of the very first slides about the plastic 3D printed firearms that are capable of getting through metal detectors. That actually has been a federal felony, as well as it's a state felony in most states as well, to import, sell, ship, deliver, or even possess or transfer or receive any firearm that has less than 3.7 ounces of steel. So all firearms in the United States, ever since 1988, have to have at the very least 3.7 ounces of steel within the firearm, so as to be able to set off a metal detector. And additionally, any firearm with major components that do not generate an accurate image by standard airport imaging technology. So any firearm that could try to trick an X-ray machine and get onto an airplane, that's also a felony. So this is the Undetectable Firearms Modernization Act, which has not passed yet. It was introduced by Representative Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania. It was HR 1477, the Undetectable Firearms Modernization Act. She just reintroduced it again in 2021. It still has not passed. But she has stated that our current law, the Undetectable Firearms Act, was passed over 30 years ago, and it doesn't address today's technologies or security risks. Today, we face a more pressing issue: firearms made entirely of plastic or with so much plastic that they fall below the current law's detection standard. So this law right here is the big one. This is the one I was mentioning earlier, the ATF Final Rule 2021 R-05F. So last year, it was signed by Attorney General Merrick Garland of the Joe Biden administration. And here's an excerpt from the Federal Register. You could see how where they talk about the importance of needing to change this interpretation. So this is not actually a law change. It wasn't, Congress didn't come together and pass any new laws or anything. It's sort of, they're using the existing law on the books already. And they're in the ATF is now interpreting those 80% lower kits that I was showing previously. The ATF now interprets them as being, even though the manufacturers claim that they're only 80% finished, therefore they're not a firearm. The ATF is not buying that anymore. They're saying, yeah, well, if it's readily buildable into a firearm, yes, it is a firearm. So those kits, are no longer able to just be sold without background checks and with no serial numbers. So now, because of that, those companies that build those kits and sell them, they have to have an FFL, Federal Firearms License, and they must abide by the normal record keeping procedures. And they also must be impressed with a serial number, so they're no longer ghost guns, except for those small number of companies, like I was mentioning in Texas, that have successfully filed an injunction against the government temporarily. This is straight from the ATF's website. So on the left side, you can see the trigger, the fire control group is not machined on that particular lower receiver. So this would actually not even be considered a firearm. So they these companies can still sell something like this because it's not quite machined down enough to be considered 80%. So I don't know if you would consider this like 65%, finished instead of 80%, but technically they can still sell this without a serial number. So it's a little bit harder for citizens to buy these and regularly quickly turn them into guns. But I'm not saying it's not impossible, but it's just probably going to be a little more difficult. But as you see there on the right side, that would be your regular old ghost gun kit that used to be sold. It has that old partially machined cavity right there. That's where the private customer would add in the milling and drill bits and stuff to cut out the final pieces of the gun. If it has anything machined like that, then that would be considered a firearm. That would need to have a serial number, and you would have to do a background check to purchase that lower receiver right there, the black one. So this is another federal law that was introduced but not passed yet. This is the 3D Printed Gun Safety Act. So it was introduced in 2019, and there's a lot of senators that are on board, or U.S. House of Representative members that are on board with this. But this would basically make it a federal felony for anyone, including STEM students, to email them people or post on the internet any of these 3D CAD gun files for even the possibility of 3D printing firearms, even if the firearm is not actually produced. But I wanted to say that a lot of analysts have argued that there's such a ban on the transfer of scientific and engineering and even online gaming, because a lot of these files, a lot of these gun files are actually made in computers on gaming files. So some people argue that this would violate the First Amendment, freedom of speech. But that would obviously be up to the courts and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court to decide. But I mean, this law hasn't even passed yet. I don't know if it ever will. But this is one way that I guess Congress is going about trying to make it to stop the creation of 3D printed ghost guns, because if they were just to simply make the files themselves illegal to distribute, that would right there would make it extremely hard for people to even legally get the data itself, because they want to make it a federal felony to even distribute them over the internet whatsoever. This has not passed yet. So I wanted to get into some state law examples. So in Maryland, pretty recently, as of last year, as of June 1st, 2022, all of the ghost guns in their state, they have to be impressed with a serial number. It has to be done by a federal firearm licensee. And then the serial number itself, they have to apply for a unique serial number, and then they have to register that serial number with the Maryland State Police Licensing Division. They have a licensing portal that they have that you can go on, and that you also need to do a full background check on these guns now. In California, another state example. So now they've recently passed it to where you have to have a federal firearms manufacturer or importer's license in order to CNC your own gun at home. So that Ghost Gunner 3 is completely illegal in California for anyone who doesn't have a federal firearms manufacturing or importer's license. The same thing with 3D printing. It's completely illegal for citizens to be 3D printing their own guns at home unless they have, the federal firearms and manufacturer importer license. But people without a firearm manufacturer license, they can produce only up to 3 firearms a year, as long as it's for their own personal use and they do not use a 3D printer or a CNC machine. However, anyone who already had a ghost gun in California who may have purchased one of those 80% lower kits before the law went into place, they have to apply for a unique serial number, again, to be added onto these metal plates, not to the plastic. They have to be added to metal plates to the bottom of the ghost gun, and then the serial number, the unique serial number, has to then be registered with California Firearms Application Reporting System. So I wanted to get into some potential investigative tools. So this is one way I see possibly where law enforcement could work with these slicer companies, because in order to 3D print something, first you have to download the files, obviously, from the internet usually, and then you have to somehow you have to purchase a 3D printer, and all 3D printers work on different types of files. So most 3D files are in the s.stl format, and on this example of the 3D printer behind me, the Creality Ender 3, it only 3D prints in G code. So you have to basically convert the file from STL to G code before you can get it to actually 3D print. So I feel like this is an area where law enforcement could potentially work with these slicer companies and even monitor whether someone might be mass producing firearms at their home. Because I'm sure these slicer companies have some sort of, monitoring capability when anyone's using their slicer software. So if they were to notice that someone were at home building, slicing hundreds and hundreds of lower receivers, sending them to a 3D printer every day, that would be a good amount of evidence to show that someone might be mass producing illegal ghost guns at their home. Another investigative tool I feel is that each individual 3D printed firearm is actually individualized because of the type of 3D PLA filament that these 3D printers decide to use. So if you arrest a suspect, you might be able to figure out how many other ghost guns that person sold to based on the telltale indicators of whatever type of color filament they always tend to use, or maybe they even put a signature in the side of the gun itself when they created the file. So that's something to keep in mind, the individuality, the creativity of these different types of 3D printed guns. They're all different. So I'm going to get into ballistics a little bit. So law enforcement already uses what's called the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. So they'll take bullets and shell casings from crime scenes, or they'll test fire bullets and shell casings in their laboratories, and they'll upload them to this database, which looks for teeny tiny microscopic striations on these bullets and shell casings and primers, and then they'll look to see if they can match that to any potential other crimes that may have happened before from other crime scenes. But in the case of 3D printed plastic gun barrels that are all plastic, like I was mentioning, the ones that are made to evade metal detectors, they have plastic barrels. The plastic is just simply too soft, and it doesn't even press the ballistic markings against the bullet. And like I was mentioning, the Luti 9mm submachine gun uses a smoothbore hydraulic barrel tube, which has no rifling on it. So that obviously wouldn't leave any lands and grooves. However, that could also be a telltale indicator, because that is unusual in and of itself, to have a handgun bullet go through a barrel that doesn't leave any striations. So that right there could be used as evidence if it was used through a smoothbore weapon. But those, like I was saying, those rifled ones, the newer rifled 3D printed firearms, like the FGC-9 Mark II, they do leave behind the striations because they're rifle barrels. So the bullet, as it's going through, it's touching the rifling, spinning, twisting down the barrel. So it would leave the telltale ballistics markings on the bullet. So I found this in 2013. James Sisdale, professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Mississippi, he conducted a research study, and he wanted to answer two questions. So to what extent does ballistics trace evidence differ from 3D printed guns to traditional firearms? And then number two, do existing analysis methods even apply to 3D printed guns? So under DART mass spectrometry, he was actually able to find this is with plastic barrels, a bullet that was shot through an all plastic barrel. He was able to find unique flecks of polymer or plastic on the retrieved bullet itself when it was fired through a plastic barrel. And his research team actually began creating a searchable database of DART mass spectrometry for about 100 common polymers. And I believe that this should be expanded upon. But he also looked into potentially developing latent fingerprints on crime scene 3D printed firearms themselves. If someone left an entire 3D printed gun at the crime scene, and there was some kind of worry that maybe because of the rough textured surface of 3D printed guns, they're not like smooth as a regular manufactured gun, though it's like a really rough textured plastic. There was some worry that maybe they don't even leave fingerprints behind, but he was able to successfully retrieve fingerprints. But he said that the black magnetic powder without fuming method was the one that worked the best to retrieve the latent fingerprints from retrieved ghost guns, plastic 3D printed ghost guns from crime scenes. Another interesting research study in 2018, University of Buffalo, they released this research study. They called it Print Tracker Fingerprinting 3D Printers Using Commodity Scanners. And in their study, they stated, it is of paramount importance to identify the origin of unlawful 3D printed products using digital forensics. I do want to mention that their study was even more, not just for 3D printed guns. They're trying to track anything that could be like counterfeited with 3D printers. But this could definitely be, in my opinion, be used for 3D printed guns as well. But they stated that 3D printers possess unique fingerprints, is what they call them, which arise from hardware imperfections during the manufacturing process, causing discrepancies in the line formation of the printed physical objects. These variations appear repeatedly and result in unique textures that can serve as, again, what they call viable fingerprints on associated 3D printed products. And then they present Print Tracker, the 3D printer identification system, which they believe can precisely trace the physical object to its source 3D printer based on its fingerprint. So if you were able to find a criminal ghost gun at a crime scene, and then you were able to somehow track down a potential suspect, and you searched their house and you found a 3D printer, and you were curious as to whether maybe that particular 3D printer created that particular 3D printed gun. With what I was reading, with up to 92% well, actually, at the very least, they said was 92% certainty, but even higher certainty. But at the very least, 92% certain, you could be certain that that 3D printer printed that particular 3D printed gun, just based on the very microscopic, intricate little fingerprints that each 3D printer apparently leaves behind when it's creating its particular product. Even though it could be from the same company, even though there's millions of these Creality Ender 3s that are sold in society, you could still be extremely confident that this particular 3D printed gun came from this particular 3D printer. I thought that was very interesting. So that's the end of the PowerPoint presentation. So I wanted to really quickly show you some 3D printed gun parts that I've actually made myself. I was curious to see how easy it would be, and it's fairly easy. It didn't take that long to do. But behind me, I have the Creality Ender 3 3D printer, and so there's a little nozzle here. It gets hot and it spits out a little bit of this PLA plastic. Like I said, this is carbon fiber plastic I bought to make the product even stronger. But this PLA filament is fed down in this line through this extruder, and it comes down through this tube and gets melted. It gets melted right at the spot, exactly where the computer tells it to. So the entire build plate moves around. This whole system moves on the X, Y, and the Z axis. So it can slowly build a part such as this firearm stock right here on the 3D printer itself, slowly over time. And then you get the end result would be fully finished stock, or or a gun magazine. And so this is some parts from the FGC9 that I was mentioning, made out of carbon fiber. So this is the grip, nice textured grip, attaches to the lower receiver, and then here's the stock. Here's the magazine. Fits in nicely. Got the magazine plate. I don't have any metal springs or anything, or any barrels. I just 3D printed some of the parts. And here's the stock that would come with it. So you can see there's the beginning of the firearm. Yeah. Printing out some other pieces as well. This one I painted to show that it's pretty easy to smooth down and get perfect in paint. These are the individual parts of the magazine, the little follower that pushes the 9mm bullet up the magazine. And there's the locking tab. There's the bottom plate that fits onto the bottom of the magazine. And you can even see it actually has a bullet indicator on the back of the magazine. So this is a 25 round capacity magazine. think that will conclude my presentation on ghost guns.
All right, thanks, Ross, for that very informative presentation. And thanks to UMT for hosting this webinar. We are we have exceeded the time a little bit, but I think we might be able to take a couple questions if people have them, or you can post them in chat. And if we have no questions, then I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. And I will send this video link afterwards. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye. We have a question. What was the name of the printer?
This was a Creality Ender 3. This one right here. It's your cheapest, most popular, common 3D printer. So I think they go about $165 or sometimes $200, but mostly less. And there's a magnetic build. You can buy these magnetic build plates that you add right here. And then when you're finished, you can take off and the part comes right off. But you can, I bought 3D printed plastic at just Micro Center, or you could buy it on the internet. But all these individual parts could be changed. I changed the tube, I changed the extruder, I changed the motor here. So you can add on different things and customize them. But my roommate even has a 3D printer that's 5 feet tall. So this is just a small version. But these 3D printed guns were designed to be built on this little 3D printer. So they made all the parts just small enough to be able to fit on these on this particular 3D printer right here. So I think they did that on purpose. The person whoever made that files made it so that it's the most easily creatable by citizens or out in society, is my opinion.
All right, any other questions? Ross, are you able to see the questions in chat?
Yeah, I'm not sure about you asking about, is anyone actually fired a carbon fiber one? But I mean, I found videos all over, even just YouTube. I mean, there's also websites called like GunTube that people will go on because YouTube has become more strict on uploading files about guns and things. So a lot of people have gone to various different websites. But even on YouTube itself, there's people that are experimenting with these different guns, and they're not even using carbon fiber. They're just using regular PLA plastic. And from what I see, they all look like most of them are fine. They're able to fire lots and lots of bullets.
There's another question.
Oh, to clip, are 80% lowers that do not have the trigger housing milled out or pinholes drilled out? So from what I saw on the ATF website, it shows that as long as the lower receiver no longer has those particular cavity cut out where the fire control group would go, as long as it doesn't have that part milled out, now that's that can be created by companies that do not have a federal firearms manufacturer or importer license, and does not have to have a serial number, and they do not have to have a background check to sell them, because technically it's not even close to being a firearm in their opinion, that it doesn't meet that even their new federal definition of firearms. So the new federal definition of firearms, in their opinion, is any of those kits that are, have up to the fire control group cut out of the lower receiver. But a lot of customers don't like that because, it's a lot harder to create the gun. If there's no cavity there to even put a mill bit in there to start cutting out the rest of it. But it's not impossible, but yeah, it just makes it a lot harder. Like I was saying, I think that would be more considered maybe like a 65% finished firearm. So at a certain point, the government had to come up with some type of they had to have a cutoff somewhere. I mean, because they can't consider every piece of metal out there a gun, so it's apparently they believe up to that certain point, once it reaches that certain point and has that cavity cut out for the fire control group, is where the government says, okay, now we think this is a gun. Now we think this is a real firearm. You have to have a background check and a serial number put on that thing.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, if not, thanks everybody for coming. Bye. Bye-bye. Oh, you're welcome.